What would you do if saving a stranger's life suddenly made mysterious armed men appear every night to protect your land without asking for anything in return? Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community around the world. Drill. The autumn wind of 1884 cut through my worn jacket like a blade as I walked the fence line of my small ranch outside Brazos Valley, Texas. My name is Ezekiel Morrison, and at 43, I'd learned that life had a way of testing a man when he least expected it. The drought had been merciless that year, and with my wife Martha gone these past 2 winters, keeping food on the table for my children, Rebecca and Samuel had become a daily struggle. I was checking the northern boundary when I heard it. A low groan carried on the wind. My hand instinctively moved to the old Colt at my hip as I followed the sound toward a cluster of mesquite trees. What I found there made my blood run cold. A man lay sprawled against the largest tree, his dark coat soaked with blood from what appeared to be multiple gunshot wounds. His hat had fallen beside him, revealing sandy hair matted with sweat and dirt. He couldn't have been much younger than myself, but there was something about his face, even unconscious and pale as death, that spoke of hard living and harder choices. The smart thing would have been to ride for Marshal Kane in town. The safe thing would have been to leave well enough alone. But as I knelt beside the stranger, checking for signs of life, I thought of Martha and the countless times she'd reminded me that mercy was never wasted, even when it seemed foolish. His pulse was weak but steady. The wounds looked bad, but I'd seen worse during my time in the war. Without giving myself time to reconsider, I managed to get him across my horse and headed back to the ranch. "Papa, who is that man?" Rebecca asked as I carried the stranger into our small cabin. At 16, my daughter had inherited her mother's sharp eyes and quick mind. "Someone who needs our help," I replied, laying him on the spare cot in the back room. "Samuel, heat some water. Rebecca, fetch the clean cloth from your mother's sewing basket." For 3 days, the man whom I'd come to think of simply as the stranger drifted between consciousness and fever dreams. During his lucid moments, he spoke little, offering only that his name was Josiah and that he was much obliged for my kindness. There was something in his eyes, a wariness that spoke of a man accustomed to looking over his shoulder. On the 4th morning, I woke to find him sitting up, though he winced with every movement. "You should still be resting," I told him, bringing a cup of coffee to the bedside. "I've imposed on your hospitality long enough, Mr. Morrison, Ezekiel Morrison, and you haven't imposed on anything. A man does what's right." Josiah studied me with pale blue eyes that seemed to look straight through to a person's soul. "In my experience, Mr. Morrison, not many men share that philosophy. Maybe you've been running with the wrong sort of men." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his weathered face. "Maybe I have at that." Indeed. That evening, as we sat on the porch after supper, Josiah finally began to open up about his circumstances. "I was riding with a group of men when we ran into trouble near Eagle Pass," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Some folks in these parts don't take kindly to our line of work." "And what line of work would that be?" He was quiet for a long moment, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, the kind that doesn't ask too many questions and pays well enough to keep a man fed. I understood then. The stranger was likely an outlaw of some sort, probably running from the law or from other men equally dangerous. The smart thing would have been to send him on his way immediately. But something about Josiah Caldwell, for that was the full name he'd eventually given me, made me hesitate. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the usual sounds of the ranch settling down for sleep, I heard something different. Voices, low and careful, coming from outside. My heart hammered as I grabbed my rifle and crept to the window. What I saw defied explanation. 3 men on horseback sat silently at the edge of my property, barely visible in the moonlight. They weren't approaching the house, just watching, waiting. After an hour, they rode away as quietly as they'd come. The next morning, I mentioned the incident to Josiah over breakfast. His reaction was immediate and troubling. His face went dead serious, and he pushed back from the table. "I need to leave," he said simply. "Today. Those men last night, they were looking for you. Mr. Morrison, there are things about me you don't understand, things that could put you and your children in danger." But even as he spoke, I could see he was in no condition to ride. The fever had weakened him more than he wanted to admit, and despite his protests, he could barely make it across the room without support. "You're not going anywhere until you're properly healed," I told him firmly. "As for danger, I've faced worse than whatever trouble you've brought to my door. That second night they came again. But this time, there were 5 riders, and they positioned themselves at different points around the ranch. I watched from my window, rifle ready. But again, they made no move toward the house. They simply maintained their silent vigil until dawn, then disappeared like ghosts. On the 3rd night, I decided to confront whatever was happening. Armed with my rifle and all the courage I could muster, I walked out to meet the mysterious riders. But as I approached the nearest one, he simply touched the brim of his hat in greeting and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Evening, Mr. Morrison. No need for concern. We're just making sure you and yours sleep safe." "Who are you? What do you want?" "We want nothing, sir. Just paying a debt of gratitude." Before I could ask what he meant, the rider had melted back into the shadows, leaving me standing alone in my own yard with more questions than answers. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. William Hutchins, a neighboring rancher who'd been trying to buy my land for months, rode up with 2 hired men flanking him. Hutchins was the kind of man who wore his wealth like a weapon, always dressed in fine clothes, and quick to remind folks of his importance in the county. "Morrison," he called out before even dismounting, "I hear you've been harboring strangers on your property." "Good morning to you too, Bill. What business is it of yours who I invite to my table?" Hutchins dismounted, his hired men following suit. I noticed both men wore their guns low and loose, the mark of professionals. When those strangers bring trouble to our peaceful community, it becomes everyone's business. "I haven't seen any trouble." "Really? Then you haven't noticed the armed men riding your property lines every night?" My blood chilled, but I kept my expression neutral. "I haven't noticed anything that concerns you, Bill. Look, Ezekiel, I've made you fair offers for this land, more than fair considering its condition. But if you're going to turn my valley into a haven for outlaws and gunfighters, well, that changes things." There was a threat in his words that made my hand drift toward my sidearm. But before either of us could escalate further, Josiah appeared in the doorway of the cabin. Even weakened by his injuries, there was something about his presence that immediately commanded attention. "Mr. Hutchins, isn't it?" Josiah said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the big rancher take a step back. "I believe you have business elsewhere." One of Hutchins' hired guns took a step forward, his hand moving toward his weapon. "Maybe you didn't hear right, stranger. Mr. Hutchins was having a conversation. What happened next occurred so quickly, I almost missed it." Despite his injuries, Josiah's hand moved with lightning speed, drawing a Colt that appeared from nowhere and having it aimed at the gunman's chest before the man could clear leather. "The conversation is over," Josiah said, his voice deadly calm. Hutchins' face had gone pale, and both his men had frozen with their hands halfway to their guns. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then Hutchins gestured curtly to his men, and they backed away. "This isn't finished, Morrison," Hutchins called out as he mounted his horse. But his eyes never left Josiah, and there was something like recognition and fear in his expression. After they'd ridden away, I turned to Josiah. "Just who exactly are you?" But before he could answer, my daughter Rebecca came running from the barn, her face flushed with excitement and worry. "Papa, there are men coming up the road. A lot of them." I grabbed my rifle and moved to the front of the house, Josiah beside me despite his condition. What I saw made my mouth go dry. At least a dozen riders were approaching at a steady pace, dust rising behind them like a brown cloud. They rode with the kind of formation that spoke of military discipline or long experience riding together. "Josiah," I said quietly, "I think it's time you told me the truth about who you really are." But as the riders drew closer, I could see that their leader was raising his hand in a gesture of peace, not war. And there was something in Josiah's expression, not fear, but something that looked almost like relief. "The truth, Mr. Morrison," he said quietly, "is more complicated than you might imagine." In Chapter 2. The riders stopped about 50 yards from my cabin, close enough to speak but far enough to show they came in peace. Their leader, a tall man with iron-grey hair and a marshal's badge glinting on his vest, dismounted and walked forward with his hands visible and empty. "Josiah Caldwell," he called out, "we need to talk." I felt Josiah tense beside me, but to my surprise, he stepped forward rather than reaching for his gun. "Marshal Davidson," he replied, his voice carrying across the distance. "I figured you'd catch up eventually." "May I approach, Mr. Morrison?" the marshal asked, addressing me directly. "I believe we have matters to discuss that concern us all." I nodded, though I kept my rifle ready. As Marshal Davidson drew closer, I could see he was older than I'd first thought, probably past 50, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of long years in the saddle. More importantly, there was an honesty in his eyes that made me inclined to trust him. "Mr. Morrison," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully, "Marshal James Davidson, Territorial Marshal out of Austin. I believe you've been caring for my friend here." "Your friend?" Davidson's weathered face creased in what might have been a smile. "It's a long story, and one that Josiah here probably hasn't told you yet. You mind if we sit a spell? My men will keep their distance." We settled on the porch, Rebecca bringing coffee without being asked. Samuel had positioned himself where he could watch the other riders, his young face serious with the responsibility of being the man of the house when trouble came calling. "Mr. Morrison," Davidson began, "what has Josiah told you about himself?" "That he was riding with some men and ran into trouble near Eagle Pass. That he works in a line of business that doesn't ask many questions." Davidson chuckled, a sound with little humor in it. "Well, he's not wrong about that last part. Josiah, you want to tell him, or should I?" Josiah was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the horizon. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. "Mr. Morrison, for the past 5 years, I've been working as an undercover agent for the territorial government. My job has been to infiltrate outlaw gangs, gather evidence, and help bring them to justice. I felt like I'd been kicked by a mule. You're a lawman, of sorts, the kind that can't carry a badge or acknowledge his real work, because the moment word gets out, he's a dead man." Marshal Davidson nodded grimly. "Josiah's been responsible for bringing down some of the worst gangs operating between here and the Mexican border. The Castellanos brothers, Black Pete Wilson, the Ramirez outfit. All of them are either dead or in territorial prison because of information Josiah provided. But the men who shot you were members of the Hutchins gang," Josiah finished. "And yes, that Hutchins, your neighbor Bill, we've been tracking his operation for over a year. Cattle rustling, stage robbery, even some killings when folks got too curious about his sudden wealth. The pieces were falling into place now, but the picture they formed was more dangerous than I'd imagined. So when those men have been watching my property, they're some of my contacts," Davidson explained. "Men who've worked with Josiah before, keeping an eye on things while he recovered. We couldn't risk moving him to town. Too many of Hutchins' people might recognize him." Rebecca, who had been listening quietly from the doorway, stepped forward. "Papa, does this mean we're in danger?" It was Josiah who answered, his voice gentle but serious. "Miss Rebecca, I won't lie to you. Bill Hutchins is a dangerous man, and if he's figured out who I really am, then yes, there could be trouble. But I want you to know that I'll do everything in my power to keep you and your family safe." "That's not your responsibility," I said firmly. "You didn't ask to be brought here." "No, but you chose to save my life when you could have left me to die. That makes it my responsibility." Marshal Davidson leaned forward. "Mr. Morrison, we have a proposition for you. We're planning to move against Hutchins within the week. We have enough evidence to arrest him and most of his gang, but we need Josiah to testify about what he witnessed during his time with them." "Ah, what does that have to do with me? Hutchins suspects something, or he wouldn't have come around asking questions today. If he thinks you know too much, he might try to silence you and your family before we can move against him." The coffee in my cup had gone cold, but I barely noticed. "You're saying my helping Josiah has put my children at risk?" "I'm saying that evil men sometimes target innocent folks," Davidson replied. "But I'm also saying we have a plan to end this threat permanently." "What kind of plan?" Josiah and Davidson exchanged a look. "We want to set a trap," Josiah said. "Let Hutchins think he has the upper hand, draw him and his men out where we can take them all at once. And you want to use my ranch as bait." "We want to give you and your family the best chance of staying safe," Davidson corrected. "If we take Hutchins down properly, with enough evidence to ensure he hangs, then this threat ends forever. If we don't, you'll be looking over your shoulder for the rest of your life." I looked at my children, Rebecca trying to appear brave, and Samuel fighting to hide his fear. Then I thought about Martha and what she would have done. She'd always believed that sometimes a person had to take a stand, even when it was dangerous. "What do you need me to do?" The plan they outlined was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. Word would be spread that Josiah had told me everything about Hutchins' operation, and that I was planning to ride to town to speak with the local marshal. This would force Hutchins to act quickly, likely attacking the ranch to silence all witnesses. "But we'll be ready," Davidson assured me. "Josiah's contacts will be positioned around your property, and my men will be close enough to respond when Hutchins shows himself. And if something goes wrong, then we'll deal with that when it happens," Josiah said simply. "But, Mr. Morrison, I've seen Hutchins work. He's not the kind of man who leaves loose ends. If we don't force this confrontation on our terms, he'll choose his own time and place, and that might be much worse for your family." That evening, after Marshal Davidson and his men had ridden away to prepare, I sat with my children on the porch and told them what was going to happen. Rebecca took the news with the steady courage she'd inherited from her mother, but Samuel's young face showed the strain of trying to be braver than his years. "Papa," he asked quietly, "what if those bad men come tonight?" I put my arm around my son's shoulders. "Then we'll face them together." "But Samuel, I want you to know that sometimes in life, a man has to choose between safety and doing what's right. Your mother always believed that mercy and justice were worth fighting for. Is that why you helped Mr. Josiah?" "That's exactly why." Later that night, as I checked the locks and made sure my rifle was loaded, Josiah found me in the barn. "Having second thoughts?" he asked. "Every minute, but that doesn't change what needs doing. Mr. Morrison, Ezekiel, I want you to know that I've never had anyone risk their family for my sake before. It's not a responsibility I take lightly. I'm not doing this for you, Josiah. I'm doing it because Hutchins and men like him think they can take whatever they want from decent people. My Martha always said evil only wins when good folks are too scared to stand up. Your wife sounds like she was a remarkable woman." She was, and she'd never forgive me if I let fear keep me from protecting my neighbors from a man like Hutchins. We stood in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the night sounds of the ranch. Then Josiah spoke again. "There's something else you should know, about those men who've been watching your property." "What about them?" "They're not just my contacts from other assignments. Some of them are men whose lives I've saved over the years. Others are family members of people I've helped. When word went out that I was hurt and being cared for by a good man, they came on their own. No orders from Davidson, no official duty. They came because they wanted to repay a debt." I thought about the quiet dignity of the rider I'd spoken with, his simple words about paying a debt of gratitude. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand that the choices you make matter. The kindness you showed a stranger has earned you more protection than you know. And after this is over, if anything ever threatens you or your family again, you won't face it alone." The next morning brought news from town that chilled my blood. Marshal Kane rode out to inform us that 2 of Hutchins' known associates had been asking questions about me at the general store and the saloon. They wanted to know about my routine, when I usually came to town, whether I traveled alone. "It's starting," Josiah said grimly. "Hutchins is gathering information for his move. How long do we have?" "Not long. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. But soon." As the sun began to set, I gathered my children in the main room of the cabin. "Rebecca, Samuel, I need you both to listen carefully. Tonight, you're going to sleep in the root cellar with blankets and water. I know it's not comfortable, but it's the safest place if trouble comes." "Papa, I want to help," Samuel protested. "You will help by keeping your sister safe and staying out of the line of fire. That's the most important job there is." As darkness fell, I took my position at the front window while Josiah, despite his injuries, covered the back of the house. The waiting was the hardest part, listening to every sound and wondering if it might be the last peaceful moment we'd have. At 10 o'clock, the silence was broken by the distant sound of hoofbeats, many horses moving fast. I caught Josiah's eye across the room and saw my own grim determination reflected there. "This is it," I whispered. But as the riders thundered closer, I began to make out individual voices, and what I heard made my blood freeze. "Burn them out!" someone was shouting. "Kill them all!" Chapter 3. The thunder of hoofbeats grew louder as Hutchins and his men approached, their voices carrying clearly in the night air. I counted at least 8 distinct riders, maybe more, far outnumbering what I'd expected. My heart pounded as I checked my rifle one final time and whispered a prayer for my children's safety. "Ezekiel Morrison!" Hutchins' voice boomed across the yard. "Come out and face what's coming to you." I glanced toward Josiah, who had positioned himself near the back window despite his injuries. He caught my eye and nodded grimly. We both knew there was no backing down now. "Morrison," Hutchins called again. "I know you're in there with that federal spy. You've got one chance to hand him over, and maybe I'll let your children live." Duty. The threat against Rebecca and Samuel ignited something fierce in my chest. I'd faced Confederate cavalry and survived 2 winters without enough food, but nothing had ever made me angrier than hearing this man threaten my family. "Bill Hutchins," I called back through the window, "you're trespassing on my land. Ride away now and we'll call it even." His laughter was ugly and cold. "Even? Old man, you cost me everything when you decided to play nursemaid to a federal agent. Do you have any idea how much money I've lost because of what he knows?" "I know you've been stealing from honest folks for years," I shouted back. "Maybe it's time you paid the price. The only one paying a price tonight is you, eh?" That's when I heard it, the distinctive whistle of one of Josiah's contacts carried on the night wind. 3 short, sharp notes that meant the hidden men were in position. But as I strained to listen, I realized something was wrong. More riders were approaching from the east, their hoofbeats adding to the confusion. "Josiah," I called quietly, "are those more of Hutchins' men?" Before he could answer, gunfire erupted from multiple directions, but instead of bullets hitting our cabin, they seemed to be aimed at Hutchins' men. Shouts of confusion and anger filled the night as the gang found themselves caught in crossfire from positions they couldn't see. What the hell? Hutchins' voice was cut off by the crack of rifle fire, and I heard him bellow orders to his men. "It's a trap! Take cover!" Through my window, I could see muzzle flashes from at least 6 different positions around the ranch, creating a deadly circle around Hutchins and his gang. The men Josiah had mentioned, his contacts and those who owed him debts, had turned my property into a battlefield where justice finally had the upper hand. "Now!" Josiah called out, and despite his injuries, he kicked open the back door and began firing at the gang members trying to use our barn for cover. I added my rifle to the fight, picking my targets carefully in the chaotic darkness. These weren't just outlaws threatening my family. They were men who had terrorized honest folks throughout the valley for years. Every shot I fired felt like justice for people who'd been too afraid to fight back. The battle was fierce, but brief. Caught between the cabin and the hidden rifleman, Hutchins' gang found themselves outnumbered and outgunned. Within minutes, half of them were down, and the rest were either surrendering or trying to flee into the darkness. But Hutchins himself wasn't finished. As the gunfire died down, I saw him breaking from cover near the barn, heading straight for the cabin with a rifle in his hands and murder in his eyes. "Morrison!" he screamed. "This ends with you!" I stepped out onto the porch to meet him, my rifle ready. In the moonlight, I could see his face twisted with rage and desperation. This was a man who'd built his wealth on the suffering of others, and now his world was collapsing around him. "It's over, Bill," I told him. "Your men are dead or captured. Put down the gun." "Over?" He laughed wildly. "It's over when I say it's over." He raised his rifle, but before he could fire, another shot rang out from behind me. Hutchins spun and fell, his weapon flying from his hands. Josiah appeared beside me, smoking Colt in his hand, moving with the fluid grace of a man whose injuries hadn't slowed his gun hand. "It's over," Josiah said simply. As the dust settled, figures emerged from the darkness around the ranch. I counted 12 men, all armed, all moving with the quiet competence of experienced fighters. But what struck me most was their demeanor. These weren't hired guns or mercenaries. They moved with purpose and dignity, men who had come to settle a debt of honor. Marshal Davidson appeared shortly after, leading a small army of territorial marshals and deputies. "Good work," he told Josiah as they surveyed the aftermath. "We got them all." "Not all my doing," Josiah replied, nodding toward me. "Mr. Morrison here proved that courage doesn't require a badge." As the marshals rounded up the surviving gang members and tended to the wounded, I went to check on my children. Rebecca and Samuel emerged from the root cellar shaken but unharmed, and I held them close as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. "Is it really over, Papa?" Samuel asked. "It's over, son." But the night held one more surprise. As the official business wound down and the marshals prepared to transport their prisoners, one of Josiah's mysterious contacts approached me. He was a weathered man in his 50s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of honest work. "Mr. Morrison," he said, touching his hat respectfully. "Name's Thomas Hart. I own a ranch up near Abilene. What brings you so far from home, Mr. Hart?" 5 years ago, my daughter was taken by the Castellanos gang. They didn't treat her kindly. Josiah got her back for me and made sure those animals paid for what they did. When word went out that he needed help, well, it wasn't even a question. As Hart walked away, another man approached, then another. One by one, Josiah's contacts introduced themselves and told me their stories. A farmer whose stolen cattle Josiah had recovered, a storekeeper whose son Josiah had saved from a gang press, a preacher whose church had been rebuilt with money recovered from outlaws Josiah had helped capture. "I had no idea," I told Josiah as the last of the men prepared to leave. "All those people whose lives you've touched." "That's the thing about doing right by folks," he replied. "You never know when that kindness might come back to help you." 3 days later, Marshal Davidson returned with news that would change everything. "Josiah," he said, settling onto my porch with a legal document in his hands, "you're officially dead." "Come again?" "According to our records, Josiah Caldwell died in the shootout at the Morrison Ranch while heroically helping defend an innocent family from outlaws. The territorial government is very grateful for his service, and his family will receive a pension for his sacrifice." Josiah stared at the marshal. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying you've done enough. 5 years undercover, more gang leaders captured than any agent in territorial history, and you nearly died doing it. It's time for Josiah Caldwell, the federal agent, to rest in peace." "But who am I supposed to be now?" Davidson smiled. "That's up to you. You've got a clean slate and a new chance at life. Question is, what do you want to do with it?" Josiah was quiet for a long moment, then looked at me. "Mr. Morrison, I don't suppose you could use a partner on this ranch. someone who knows his way around cattle and isn't afraid of hard work. I thought about the offer, about what it would mean to have a man like Josiah as a neighbor and friend. Then I thought about Martha and what she would have said about second chances and new beginnings. "Partner might be too formal," I said finally, "but I could always use another hand, and my children could use a friend who knows how to handle trouble." "I don't have much money to contribute." Davidson reached into his coat and pulled out another envelope. "Actually, you do. The territorial reward money for the capture of the Hutchins gang comes to $5,000. Half goes to Mr. Morrison here for his courage and assistance. The other half goes to the family of the late Josiah Caldwell, which I believe would be his next of kin and business partner. That autumn, as we worked together to expand the ranch and build a proper future for Rebecca and Samuel, I often thought about the strange twist of fate that had brought us all together. An act of simple mercy had transformed not just my family's circumstances, but had given a good man a chance to leave behind a dangerous life and find peace. The mysterious riders never came again, but I knew they were still out there, watching over their own families and communities, ready to answer the call if justice needed defending. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind was right, I could swear I heard that familiar whistle in the distance, a reminder that good deeds create bonds that last a lifetime. Josiah proved to be everything I'd hoped for in a partner, and more than I dared hope for as a friend. He helped Rebecca with her mathematics, taught Samuel to handle a gun properly, and never once complained about the simple life we'd built together. Sometimes I caught him staring at the horizon with that faraway look, and I knew he was remembering the dangerous years he'd left behind. But those moments grew fewer as time passed, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of honest work and a place where he truly belonged. The Morrison Ranch prospered in ways I'd never imagined possible, but more importantly, we'd learned that mercy given freely always returns in unexpected forms, and that sometimes saving a stranger's life means saving your own as well. What did you think of this story of redemption and second chances? Don't forget to subscribe for more tales from the Old West, and let us know in the comments which character's journey touched you the most. Your support helps us bring you more authentic frontier stories every week.